point of the matter was to create the impression that Jerry Falwell was a whoremaster and that his mother was a whore. That's not nice.
Every time a politician wraps himself in a flag, we will be there, Zippos in hand, to oppose them.
I heard, go back to the zoo where you belong, shut up you black water buffaloes, shut the f*** up, get out of here.
Freedom, in fact, exists for those who are willing to fight for it.
We are viewed as almost crazed with our devotion to free expression by a lot of countries in the world that we would view as free countries.
The pornographic magazine Hustler prides itself on being crass and outrageous. In November 1983, Hustler published what at first glance looked like an advertisement from a well-known campaign for Campari liquor, in which celebrities discussed their first time drinking Campari. But in this ad, the celebrity was Baptist TV preacher Jerry Falwell, and the interview described Falwell drunkenly having sex with his mother in an outhouse. Falwell was livid.
I think that there are still some areas that somewhere should be considered sacred. I thought that ad crossed over that line. I thought that it was so bad and so mean-spirited, so vulgar, that at some point someone should be able to say you can't go that far.
Perhaps no war of words has been more furious or more fundamental than the one which erupted over this single fake ad. It pitted Falwell against the publisher of Hustler, Larry Flynt, a man who for years had fought for his right to print anything he saw fit.
We're the strongest country in the world today, only because we are the freest country in the world today. And I don't want any American, anywhere, to ever forget that that strength lies in our principles to be free.
At the bottom of the fake Falwell ad in small type were the words ad parody, not to be taken seriously. For the preacher and his attorney, Norman Roy Grutman, the disclaimer only added insult to injury.
Don't take this seriously. This is just parody in minuscule type. That's not what it was about. The point of the matter was to create the impression that Jerry Falwell was a whoremaster and that his mother was a whore. And that's not nice, and that's not permissible.
Falwell sued Flynt for libel, invasion of privacy, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. No American has relied more on the First Amendment for his survival than Larry Flynt. In the 1970s, he was repeatedly prosecuted for publishing Hustler. Each time, he denounced obscenity laws in the name of the First Amendment. During a recess at one such trial in Lawrenceville, Georgia, a gunman fired 2 bullets into Flynt's stomach. One of them lodged near his spine and paralyzed his legs. No one was ever tried for the crime. Flynt said that he gave up his legs for his freedom of speech and would willingly give up his life. Once a born-again Christian, he rejected the Bible and directed much of Hustler's bile against evangelist preachers like Jimmy Swaggart and Jerry Falwell. In an interview with American Justice, Flynt, his voice weakened by recent surgery, attacked his old nemesis.
Jerry Falwell is a phony from word go. He's interested in one thing, making money, and getting him a little respect and notoriety from that Bible school he got down in Virginia.
The trial of Falwell versus Flynt opened in Roanoke, Virginia in December 1984. The preacher's key evidence was a videotaped interview with Flynt. 6 months before the trial, Falwell's lawyer had decided to depose Flynt or interview him under oath. At the time, Flynt was already in prison, serving time in South Carolina for a contempt of court charge. Paranoid and plagued by bed sores, he gave a coarse, hostile performance that was virtually an act of legal suicide.
Yes. I said exactly the opposite of what my attorney would have wanted me to say. I agree with
Ricky, every line you've got in that deposition is bizarre. I intended it that way. I was angry. I didn't care.
The jurors watched Flint admit on tape that he wanted to hurt Falwell's reputation, but that wasn't what had Flint's lawyers worried. Flint also claimed that the ad was true, that he had proof that Falwell and Falwell's mother did have intercourse at an outhouse.
I have an affidavit signed by 3 different people from Lynchburg, Virginia, stating, that purely and simply that they had witnessed this act.
This was, in fact, just bluster, but it was undermining the entire defense strategy. The Hustler lawyers planned to argue that the ad was not libel, but parody. No one could seriously believe that the Reverend Jerry Falwell could really have drunken sex with his mother.
But the fact that he said that he meant this as a true statement and that he had proof of that now made it a lot more difficult for me to try to convince a jury that it's unreasonable to think this was meant as a true statement.
Defense attorney Isaacman explained to the jury that the publisher had been deranged by medication and manic depression in prison. In the courtroom, Flint was clean-shaven and well-behaved. Falwell was not impressed.
I think he's a master actor. He's a destroyer of reputations, one who hurts people as a profession. And I think that today he is putting on a similar act that he's done in dozens of courtrooms all over the country.
Falwell's lawyer, Norman Roy Grutman, argued that while the allegations in the parody were absurd, they were not beyond the possible, and that for Flint to depict a minister like Falwell as an incestuous drunk would not only smear his reputation, it would damage his livelihood, which depended on an upright moral image.
Words are weapons. And when you have words used to that effect, that weapon must be punished just as we punish people who use guns or other things like it.
Throughout the trial, Grutman made sure the jury knew the extremes to which Larry Flint pressed his right to expression. During his closing arguments, he displayed a Hustler centerfold. One juror refused to look. After 2 days, the jury returned an unprecedented verdict. They said the ad parody was literally unbelievable. So Flint was not guilty of libeling Falwell. On the other hand, the jurors decided the insult to Falwell was worth some compensation. They awarded the minister $200,000 for intentional infliction of emotional distress. Falwell claimed victory.
What this jury has said today is there is a line. The First Amendment is not absolute.
It was going to cost Mr. Flint more money to appeal that decision than it would have been to pay. And yet he chose to appeal it because he thought the First Amendment was at stake here.
Garbage, rubbish, that they are champions of the First Amendment. They are champions of the jingle in their pocketbook. They have no more interest in the First Amendment than some illiterate clown. They are interested in making money out of the First Amendment.
As his lawyers appealed the verdict, Flint promised to keep battling Falwell in his own way.
I would say he will most likely appear in the pages of Hustler in the future.
True to his word, Hustler published the disputed parody again. It was classic Flint stubbornness. Despite his defiance, Flint lost his appeal in the Federal Circuit Court. That meant that he only had one place left to take his case, the U.S. Supreme Court, and the High Court agreed to hear it. Since the Virginia jury had decided the ad was a parody, the justices wanted to test a fundamental idea, that the victim of a parody could claim the right to damages.
Now that can be very, very worrisome to writers, to editors, to television people, whoever. Because what it means is that even if you don't defame somebody, according to the law, you may still get a whopping judgment if you hurt his feelings.
Now the case really was about the First Amendment right to a free press. American publishers, horrified that some limitations would inevitably lead to more, showered Larry Flint with support. The New York Times and the American Society of Cartoonists were among those who filed legal briefs supporting Hustler. Falwell thinks this was an overreaction.
To think that there's some connection between the New York Times losing some advantage in the First Amendment And Larry Flint losing that law case over that ad, that is so spurious that it's groundless.
The Supreme Court heard the arguments in December 1987. Jerry Falwell was there, and so was Larry Flint, who had once been arrested for screaming four-letter obscenities at these very justices. Alan Isaacman made the case for Flint first, arguing that Falwell, as one of the most famous Americans of the day, was a fair target for satire, and he insisted it was satire. The jury in Roanoke had said so. Even at this vulgar extreme, the ad parody was a joke, plain and simple.
That wasn't an easy argument to make, because not many of them fellows have got a sense of humor. You have to have a sense of humor on that Falwell parody, or I don't think you're going to get anywhere.
Gretman argued that this was not freedom of the press, it was abuse of the press for the sheer perverse joy of causing injury. That was not protected by the First Amendment. If there wasn't some limit on press criticism, he explained, no one would want to enter public life.
And I said to the justices, who do you want? Larry Flint for president? And that's what you're going to get. Because take a look, all the people of character, all the people who have something to contribute to this country are fleeing being a part of the electoral process.
I don't think it's a valid argument at all. I think that there may be a few thin-skinned people who would be deterred from going into public life because they're afraid that something will be said about them that's offensive to them or insulting to them. But that's just one of the things that follow from going into public life, that people are going to be critical of you.
George Washington once threw up during breakfast. He was reading something about himself. So they were used to all of that. They didn't like it, but they didn't say anything wrong with it either. That was what the First Amendment was all about.
It was now up to the justices to decide whether that was what the First Amendment was all about. Both parties left the High Court still arguing their case to the press.
I feel that we're doing a service to the legitimate media, not a disservice, to help protect the rights of human beings in our society from the likes of Larry Flint.
I think that the First Amendment gives me the right to be offensive, and that's what the issue is here.
3 months later, the justices unanimously overturned the award for emotional distress, ruling that Flint's parody was protected by freedom of speech and the press. Jerry Falwell still believes they made that decision with some regret.
I remember one of the justices, Thurgood Marshall, saying, Reverend, don't believe I've ever encountered something like that. I know how you feel. Something like that. And I could tell how that in his heart, he was saying, I'd like to choke that guy down there, but this is America.
Freedom of expression. It's at the very heart of American justice. It's how we define ourselves as Americans. We are a passionate, quarrelsome people, and proud of it. Even Great Britain, the primary source of our legal tradition, has no written guarantee of uncensored speech. But America went further. The First Amendment to our Constitution says, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. Simple, powerful words, and a powerful idea that democracy means the freedom to think and speak as we please, and anything less is not democracy at all. But is it that simple? If the speech of one American harms another, to what extent should that be allowed? Even Americans whose ideas are filled with hate seek protection under the wide umbrella of the First Amendment. That's next, when American Justice returns. We now return to War of Words here on A&E. Hate, American style. Cross burnings to terrorize blacks. Cemeteries vandalized to frighten Jews. These and other messages of racial hatred challenge American justice to ask one of the toughest questions in the battles over free speech. When, if ever, is hateful expression so harmful that authority should be allowed to suppress it? In 1977, a group of American Nazis made plans for an extremely provocative march. The Chicago-based National Socialist Party of America had been holding demonstrations in a city park. The city, weary of the violent clashes the Nazis often provoked, banned any further marches. So the Nazi leader, Frank Collin, decided to hold a march in the nearby village of Skokie, which had a large Jewish population, including more than 7,000 Holocaust survivors. Skokie residents protested. They convinced a judge to issue an injunction against the march. The Nazis now enlisted the help of the American Civil Liberties Union and ACLU lawyer David Goldberger.
I felt that whatever their identity, and as obnoxious as their ideas were, they had the same right as everyone else to speak their views in public. But I felt no particular warmth or comfort in dealing with those clients. It's not easy dealing with clients who basically are anti-Semites when you're Jewish.
An Illinois appeals court then ruled that the Nazis could march, but they could not wear any swastikas. Swastikas, said the court, amounted to so-called fighting words. The phrase comes from a controversial 1942 U.S. Supreme Court decision, which said some opinions are not protected as speech.
Fighting words are words which, by their nature, have a high likelihood of leading immediately to physical violence. There are some things which, if I were to say to you about your mother, you would be more likely to hit me than simply to say, well, that's just not true. I mean, she's really all right if you really knew her.
I always thought that was a strange doctrine, because if you say something to somebody and then he punches you in the nose, how come you're the person who gets punished?
Because, says the doctrine, some speech is so hurtful, so provocative, that it's pretty much the same thing as punching someone first. So were swastikas fighting words because they symbolized genocide and racism? The Nazis said they were not, and the Illinois Supreme Court now agreed with the Nazis. The swastika was a symbol and was protected as a form of speech under the First Amendment. But by that time, the village of Skokie had passed its own laws aimed at preventing the march, including a ban on military-style uniforms. The ACLU sued to have those laws revoked.
It seemed to me that if those ordinances were valid, then there was not any extremist or radical group that couldn't be stopped one way or another from holding public assemblies. And in that sense, they were very dangerous ordinances.
Collin and his band of young Nazis were now the most famous radicals in America, all because of the efforts to silence them. Rumors were even spreading that villagers were building snipers' nests around the town square.
They felt that this man not only should speak, but he should be dead. I did not want anyone killed. I did not want anybody hurt. And I felt that on the other hand, to back off and to accede to the threats was really going to set a precedent that we'd all regret.
At that point, a federal judge, Bernard Decker, ruled that the Skokie laws aimed at preventing the march were unconstitutional. Upon further appeal, the U.S. Supreme Court refused to hear the case. The Nazis could proceed.
The Constitution has been upheld. Freedom is not just a nebulous concept on paper, but freedom, in fact, exists for those who are willing to fight for it.
The judge looked at the parties and said that there is a Constitution and there's a First Amendment in this country, and I don't care who's involved, we've got to stand behind the First Amendment. I'm proud of it.
The stage was now set for a vicious confrontation when the Nazis unexpectedly backed down.
I have decided that because we agitated for free speech and won our right to free speech back completely, that the demonstration scheduled for Sunday in Skokie is henceforth canceled.
Instead, the Nazis demonstrated in their old haunt, Chicago itself. 2,000 policemen held back furious crowds who pelted the Nazis with eggs and drowned out their message of hate with screams of protest.
It's kind of lousy to be in a situation like that and then to have to say afterwards, I know I did the right thing and I'd do it again. I still receive letters periodically from people in Skokie who said, I just wanted you to know that at the time I thought you were crazy, but now in retrospect, maybe you did the right thing.
Just as a Nazi march is a clear expression of anti-Semitism, so the burning of crosses has long been a rabid message of hate directed at blacks. On a June night in 1990, Russell and Laura Jones the only black couple in a white neighborhood of St. Paul, Minnesota, awoke to see a small cross burning on their property. The cross was an amateur affair, 2 chair legs tied together and wrapped in terry cloth. But the message was plain, even to their 7-year-old son.
I think they don't want us here.
It scares me, and it is shocking.
Police arrested 17-year-old Robert Victora, a neighborhood boy who called himself a white separatist. He was charged under a St. Paul law against hate crimes. The law prohibited any action that, quote, arouses anger, alarm, or resentment in others based on race, color, creed, religion, or gender. The boy's court-appointed lawyer, Edward Cleary, decided the law was unconstitutional.
I don't think anyone has a right to interfere with a person's privacy, to threaten them, to threaten their children in that fashion. What I do believe, and this may, other people may disagree with this, is that people have a right to have bigoted opinions.
It was a classic war over words. Cleary believed St. Paul was prosecuting the young man not for the alleged crime, but for the racist message he sent. The city could have prosecuted Victora under criminal laws that prohibit making terrorist threats. But the prosecutor said that in this case, the message of hate was an essential element of the crime.
They came in the middle of the night onto this African-American family's property, directly threatened him with the cross burning, and it brings out all of the images and the historical problems of the past with the Ku Klux Klan, of the Nazis, and the terror of people being afraid of being ripped from their homes and raped and killed.
But in the eyes of some, the St. Paul law posed the risk of what's called the slippery slope, the danger that allowing the government to restrict any speech threatens all speech.
If you ban speech based on race that's likely to arouse anger or alarm or resentment in others, conceive of it. Conceive of it in the South 30 years ago. It would have been a tool to keep the civil rights movement down. Just reverse it. Any angry person, reactionary, that saw a civil rights march could say, I find that objectionable. It arouses anger in me.
Cleary asked the juvenile court judge to throw out the St. Paul hate crime law. The judge did exactly that. The prosecutor then appealed the war of words all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. As with the Nazi case 11 years earlier, the issue became fighting words. Did burning a cross, as Robert Victora had done, constitute fighting words? An act so provocative that it begs for a violent response. If so, could it be prohibited under a very narrow hate crime law which only protected certain minorities? Over the past 20 years, cross burnings and other expressions of hate have prompted nearly all states to pass anti-hate crime laws. So anticipation ran high when the court heard arguments in the St. Paul case in December 1991.
It was very tense. The justices were very interested in obviously both sides of this issue. The courtroom was packed. It was a standing room only audience.
Even the closest court watchers weren't sure what the outcome would be. The justices then took an uncommonly long time, 7 months, to make a decision. Finally, in June 1992, by a unanimous vote, the court struck down the St. Paul hate crime law.
I hope this doesn't open up a groundswell of activity by hate mongers and right-wing extremists saying that we're protected. We can burn a cross in somebody's yard.
I'm very disappointed in the ruling, and when I try to read what was the basis for their decision, I have a hard time understanding what they're trying to say.
Russell Jones wasn't the only one. The ruling was full of disagreement among the justices themselves. All 9 justices believed the St. Paul law was so broad that it might restrict too much speech. But 5 went further. They argued that any hate crime laws which only protected certain groups were unconstitutional.
The majority decision was ultimately written by Justice Scalia, who I think wrote a rather strange opinion which threw out all of the previous precedent for analyzing First Amendment type cases and literally structured a new approach.
Scalia said the state, in this case St. Paul, but any municipal, any state agency, can select out those particular groups of people it wants to protect from offensive language. In this case, again, gays or lesbians, whatever, blacks. Scalia said, what about the handicapped. They're not in this ordinance, and they weren't.
The decision was widely viewed as a message from the court that American justice should not play favorites in society's often vicious war of words. But what about the very symbol of America itself, the flag? Should burning a flag also be protected as a form of free speech or banned because it offends so many Americans? Next, the case of a Dallas man who burned a flag and sparked a 6-year battle involving the President, Congress, and once again, the Supreme Court. War of Words will return in a moment here on A&E. We now return to War of Words. The Republican National Convention, Dallas, August 1984. Alongside the hoopla was another American ritual, dissent. Near City Hall, demonstrators opposed to President Reagan's policies waged a war of words. They chanted, "Red, white, and blue, we spit on you." One set fire to an American flag. Gregory Lee Johnson, age 28, was arrested under a Texas law against desecrating the American flag. So began one of the most fiercely debated cases over the right to free expression. Johnson was convicted, fined $2,000, and sentenced to a year in prison. He appealed on the ground that burning a flag was his form of protest, protected under the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. Johnson won. Texas, in turn, appealed the case to the U.S. Supreme Court. Texas based its appeal on patriotism. 200 years, Americans have fought and died for what the flag represents. When they do, their bodies return home, draped in the stars and bars. The Texas law was a byproduct of 1960s unrest. Students protesting the war in Vietnam burned not only their draft cards, but flags as well.
I think it's very offensive, that it was a terrible thing to do.
Of course it was offensive, said Johnson, who identified himself as a revolutionary communist. But offensiveness isn't illegal.
The Republican convention was totally offensive to me and millions of people around the world. Yes, I wanted to very much offend that whole America Uber Alles event. Yeah.
In June 1989, the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that burning the flag was a legitimate gesture of dissent, precisely what the authors of the Constitution meant the First Amendment to protect. Jubilant demonstrators immediately burned flags of all sizes, while others thought the court had made a mistake.
If anybody caught desecrating any kind of American flag or anything that our country stands for, they ought to put them in jail or do something to them. Ain't right.
But the battle wasn't over.
I believe the importance of this issue compels me to call for a constitutional amendment. Support for the First Amendment need not extend to desecration of the American flag.
It is entirely damaging to our constitutional tradition to proceed with unnecessary, superfluous amendments.
In reality, many in Congress were recalling the 1988 presidential campaign. George Bush had visited flag factories and had made a campaign issue of the Pledge of Allegiance. These were widely seen as crafty appeals to patriotic feeling. Instead of a constitutional amendment, some lawmakers now proposed a national anti-flag burning law. A few solitary voices argued that the whole business was just plain silly. But under such a law, even patriotic clothing would become contraband.
Making footwear out of the American flag. That seems to me to be desecration. If we're going to get into this kind of arcane minutia, I don't know where it'll all end.
But in October 1989, the law passed overwhelmingly. Protesters, including Gregory Johnson, responded in a predictable way. They burned flags on the U.S. Capitol steps. They were arrested. In Seattle, demonstrators went to the city post office, set fire to its flag, and ran it, still ablaze, back up the flagpole. They, too, were arrested, and soon were in federal court challenging the new law. Their attorney, civil rights lawyer William Kunstler, argued that the flag was not an icon, but merely a symbol.
And it's a symbol of good and it's a symbol of bad. And people that want to protest the bad should be allowed to burn or otherwise deface or mutilate the flag.
Within months, flag burning was again before the U.S. Supreme Court.
I said it last year, and I'm saying it again this year. We're living in a sick and dying empire that's desperately clutching at its symbol.
In June 1990, the same 5-justice majority that had agreed with Gregory Johnson 1 year before agreed again. The federal anti-flag burning law was struck down. President Bush renewed the war of words, restating his call for a constitutional amendment.
It's an American issue, and so I call on the Congress to act by July 4th, this nation's birthday.
Again, the streets glowed with burning flags and red-hot tempers.
I do not want these people to burn my symbol and my freedom.
Free speech has its limitations, and this is one of them.
If we abandon our commitment to freedom of speech, then no flag and no amendment to the Constitution can save us.
2 weeks after the court ruling, Congress voted. In both houses, the measure failed to get the 2/3 approval required to begin the process of amending the Constitution. 6 years after Gregory Johnson burned a flag in Dallas, the fight was over. But it seems that America's war of words is never ending. In the 1990s, the college campus emerged as the battlefield of choice. There, in the name of tolerance and racial harmony, speech codes have flourished. But do speech codes really offer protection for the oppressed, or censorship in what should be sanctuaries of free expression? The University of Pennsylvania faced that question when it tried to punish a white male student who called some black female students water buffaloes because they were making noise outside his dormitory window. American justice will return in a moment. We now return to War of Words here on A&E. Universities are supposed to encourage free and vigorous debate. But after a rise in racist incidents on campus in the 1980s, American colleges began adopting speech codes. Today, over 300 colleges have such codes. But do they help ease campus tensions? Or do they repress the free exchange of ideas in the name of so-called political correctness? These questions sparked a war of words at the University of Pennsylvania in 1993. On January 13th, freshman Eden Jacobowitz was studying in his dormitory. It was midnight.
I heard shouting, screaming, stomping, all sorts of noise coming from right outside in the courtyard right below my window. So I yelled, "Shut up, you water buffaloes." And then I heard them singing something about a party. So I said, "If you're looking for a party, there's a zoo a mile from here."
The women outside the dorm that evening were sisters in the Delta Sigma Theta sorority, celebrating their Founders Day.
We were not dumping, we were not hollering, we were singing 2 quiet songs. There were only 20 of us, so I don't understand how we could have been disturbing, people to the point where they would want to abuse us as we were abused.
Besides Jacobowitz, a number of other students yelled down at the women.
I heard, "Go back to the zoo where you belong. Shut up, you black water buffaloes. Shut the up. Get out of here. Get your fat asses out of here. Niggers, get out of here." So it was a combination of these racial and sexual demeaning terms that incited me.
Nikki Taylor and 4 other sorority sisters filed a complaint with the university police. When the police went to investigate, Eden Jacobowitz was the only student who admitted to shouting out of his window. He insisted he did not use the word black, but simply yelled, "Water buffaloes." Why water buffalo?
I come up with different words. I call people aardvarks. I call people manatees. I call people all sorts of weird things. And I've used these words in high school, and I've used these words in college, and they've never been meant to be anything but an Eden word.
But in the view of the sorority sisters, water buffalo was a racial slur.
It marginalized me as a black person, as a black woman. It banished me to a zoo when he said, "Go back to the zoo where you belong."
We know that Africans were brought to this country to work, and they were treated as work animals and beasts of burden. It was obvious to me that that was racial and that was prejudice and that was harassing.
The university accused Eden of violating the school's racial harassment policy when he said the words, "water buffaloes." The school official told him it didn't matter what he meant. What was important was how the words were interpreted by the women. In the cloistered world of the college campus, many believe there is no room for racism or bias of any kind, that a civil and productive environment requires restrictions on speech.
In an ideal world, maybe they wouldn't be necessary, but in the world as it exists, they are necessary because you have a lot of ignorance on college campuses, and there's a lot of resentment for members of racially oppressed or otherwise oppressed groups on campus.
But critics say the campus should be a laboratory of open debate.
This is going to sound very, very cold, but people who object to that really do not understand the need to grow into an understanding of what it is to respond to speech you don't like with your own speech, and to smash it verbally, of course. Otherwise, you're always running to some higher authority and saying, oh my God, he hurt my feelings.
Speech codes have taken different forms. One of the most extreme at the University of Connecticut banned inappropriate laughter until the school dropped the code in 1993. In the last 5 years, federal judges have thrown out speech codes at the universities of Michigan and Wisconsin because they violated the First Amendment. In April, Eden was found guilty of racial harassment. The university demanded he apologize to the women and attend a racial sensitivity program on campus.
6 floors up.
The incident would also be registered in his school file. Eden refused to sign this official settlement.
If you take a look at this settlement and you show it to anybody and you ask them, what did this kid say or what did this kid do? They'd probably say, oh, whoever this settlement is for probably violated the racial harassment code by beating up somebody because of their skin color.
Instead, Jacobowitz turned to history professor Alan Kors, a well-known crusader for free speech.
I was certain that the moment anyone with an IQ over 35 understood the facts of this case, it was over. Because if the racial harassment policy applied to this, then it applied to any word that any human being might utter that offended anyone, anytime, any place.
Kors decided the water buffalo controversy was a case of political correctness run amok and a clear violation of Eden's right to free speech.
I said to Eden, if I were you at this point, I wouldn't let them do what they're going to do to me in the dark. I would bring it out into the court of public opinion.
The case received national media attention, much of which sided with Eden. But students on campus were still divided.
In my mind, there's no question that water buffalo was a racial slur.
I believe when he says he was, misunderstood. And I think that we might be reading a little bit too much into it.
Professor Sanday and the sorority sisters felt that Jacobowitz and his advisor had circumvented the university judicial process by going to the media, something that administrators told the women they could not do. On May 14th, 1993, 4 months after the name-calling incident, the sorority sisters and Jacobowitz met in a closed hearing. 10 days later, the women dropped the charges, claiming the university had failed them. Jacobowitz felt vindicated.
I think this university has gotten to this ridiculous point where they feel that they have to protect everybody from anything that might bother them, which is completely ridiculous. Free speech should be the main goal of the university.
There's a price that's paid for that. And in all fairness, it has to be said, that price is often paid by the people least able to pay it, the people who are the victims of outrageous speech, hate speech.
No one knows that better than the Sisters of Delta Sigma Theta.
We received a lot of threats, a lot of hate mail, telling us to go back to the jungle where our sorority house is and things like that. So if people are wondering why we weren't as out there as we should have been or wanted to be, it was because we were scared.
At a certain point, the expression of hate can turn into actual bodily assault. The Constitution protects your right to hateful expression. It does not protect assault.
Wars over words have led to some of the stormiest disputes in the history of American justice. Over the past 2 centuries, Americans have gotten in the habit of saying what they think, whenever and to whomever they please. So it's no mystery that speech often becomes intertwined with other pressing issues of the day. First Amendment scholars say that free speech has also been a key to the nation's survival.
When you have people on the extremes speaking publicly, at least you know who your enemies are and what they're saying. One of the consequences of shutting down extremists is that doesn't shut them up. It just drives them underground and far away from view.
The most common criticism of First Amendment freedoms is that the umbrella is too big, that freedom of expression grants protection well beyond what the framers of the Constitution intended. But the words on the old parchment are hard to contest. Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. It does not say which speech or whose speech.
The lesson that we've learned from our history and the history of the world is that if you empower government to make those decisions, they will make them to keep themselves in office. They will make them in a way which results in the suppression not just of evil ideas, but good ones as well.
The history of American justice includes a long list of cases where the right of free speech won the day. That's not always the outcome, not by a long shot. During the Red Scare of the 1920s, some 300 Americans were thrown in prison for flying a red flag in support of communism. In 1990, a Florida record dealer was found guilty of breaking obscenity laws for selling an album by the rap group Two Live Crew. The lyrics were too explicit for the tastes of the local court. In the end, the question is, how tolerant does American society wish to be? American justice must decide whether we should restrict speech in the name of a supposedly greater good, or whether, as the great Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis believed, the solution to dangerous speech is more speech. I'm Bill Curtis. Join us again next time for another episode of American Justice here on A&E.